Sirvaliant Martin Val Brown, born December 21st, 1980. The year was 2000, and if you weren't in a DC gym or watching the Atlantic 10, you probably missed one of the most absurd scoring displays in college basketball history. Sirvaliant Brown didn't just play for George Washington, he was the entire offense. As a freshman, he averaged 24.6 points per game, trailing only Courtney Alexander for the national scoring title. He was a human heat check with a name that sounded like a folk hero and a jumper that suggested he was the next big thing. But today, Sirvaliant is a ghost of the pre-social media era. There's no high-definition mixtapes, no viral crossovers, and very little trace of his professional footprint. He was a player who thrived in a green light system that the NBA eventually viewed as a red flag. When he left school early to chase a draft night that never called his name, the legend of Sirval began to fade into a cautionary tale of height, timing, and the trap of being a pure scorer in a league looking for specialists. He was a player who outscored almost everyone, yet he couldn't find a permanent home in the league. What happened? Let's talk about it. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth. Let's get it, man. Like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know who I should do next. Stunt number 1, striking while the iron was hot. Sirvaliant Brown's story really begins before anyone ever questioned him, back when everything was working exactly how it was supposed to. Coming out of Washington, D.C., he wasn't just another guard putting up numbers, he was known. Between his high school dominance and playing with DC Assault, one of the top AAU programs at the time, his name carried real weight. And when it came to choose a college, despite offers from powerhouse programs like Duke, North Carolina, and Kentucky, he made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He stayed home and committed to George Washington after Coach Tom Penders secured the opportunity to coach there and telling him everything he wanted to hear, that the offense would be his and the ball would always be in his hands. That decision paid off immediately. As a freshman, Brown exploded onto the national scene. He didn't miss games, he didn't lack touches, and he didn't hesitate. The system was built for him, and he took full advantage of it. From his perspective, there wasn't a guard in the country better than him, and statistically, he had every reason to feel that way. At that moment, everything aligned: production, confidence, visibility, and most importantly, potential. Because that's what the NBA drafts on more than anything else, not just what you are, but what you could become. And that's exactly why that moment mattered so much. After that freshman season, Brown had real momentum. There was already pressure for him to consider going pro, and looking back, even he admitted he wished he had taken that opportunity, because once he decided to return, the rules changed. The mystery was gone. The projection was no longer based on flashes, it would now be judged against expectations, and those expectations had been set extremely high. His sophomore year didn't match that same level of production, and once that drop-off happened, the conversation shifted. Instead of asking how good he could be, scouts started asking why he wasn't producing the same way. But that's the risk every player takes when they come back to school. You're no longer building hype, you're defending it. And for Brown, that shift came at the worst possible time. What makes this even more important is that draft positioning isn't just about talent, it's about timing. Had he entered the draft after his freshman year, he likely would have at least been a second-round pick, not because he was a finished product, but because teams still had room to believe in what he might be. That belief is sometimes what gets players drafted, and once you're drafted, everything changes. You're labeled differently, you're given opportunities differently. Even a short NBA stint separates a former NBA player from someone who never made it. But by waiting, Brown allowed the league to gather more information, and in the NBA, more information rarely helps players like him. It clarifies doubts instead of hiding them. So when he finally made the jump, it wasn't from a position of rising momentum, it was from a position of questions. And that one decision, not leaving when his value was at its highest, didn't just affect his draft stock, it changed the entire way his career would be viewed moving forward. Stunt number 2 came back, then left at the worst possible time. Once Sirvaliant Brown made the decision to return for his sophomore season, the entire situation changed, even if it didn't feel like it at the time. Because coming back to school isn't just a continuation of what you were doing before, it's a trade-off. You give up projection, and in return, you're expected to prove growth. And for a player coming off a freshman year where he was one of the top scorers in the country, that meant the standard wasn't just high, it was nearly impossible to match. Now, everything he did was being compared to what they had already seen. The same 20-point game that once felt dominant now looked like a step back. The same scoring stretches that once turned heads now felt expected. That's the pressure that comes with setting the bar so high early. And instead of adding new dimensions to his game, Brown remained in a similar role. Still scoring, still carrying the offense, but not showing scouts anything different from what they had already evaluated. At the same time, things around him began to shift. The coach who recruited him and built that system around him was just about to leave, removing the structure and trust that made everything work in the first place. What was once a perfect situation suddenly became uncertain, and instead of adjusting and using that moment to reshape his game, especially transitioning more fully into a point guard role, Brown found himself in a position where expectations were rising, but development wasn't. That's where the decision to leave becomes critical, because leaving after a down year without showing improvement in areas scouts were already questioning sends a clear message. It tells teams that what they saw is likely what they're getting, and for a player his size and play style, that wasn't enough. This is where patience mattered most, not just at the peak of his success, but at the moment things started to slip. This, in all actuality, was the time to stay, to adjust, to prove he could run a team, make others better, and evolve beyond just scoring. Instead, he entered the draft at the exact moment his value was lowest, and in the NBA, timing like that doesn't just hurt, it closes doors. Stunt number 3, a shooting guard trapped in a point guard's body. This is where everything comes into focus, because Sirvaliant Brown's situation wasn't just about timing or decisions, it was about identity, and more specifically, being out of position in a way that the NBA simply doesn't allow you to get away with for the most part. At his size, the league had already decided what he was supposed to be before he ever got his opportunity. Not a scorer first, not a volume shooter, but a point guard. The league has always had its fair share of guys that could put the ball in the basket. Another undersized one is not something they needed. Someone expected to run a team, control pace, make reads, and create opportunities for others before looking for his own offense is far more fitting. But that's not how he played, and more importantly, it's not how he was built or showed as a player he could be. His game was wired around scoring, around taking shots, around being aggressive with the ball, and while that works in certain systems, it becomes a problem when the role you're expected to fill requires a completely different mindset. Because at the next level, it's not about what you can do in isolation, it's about how well you fit into a structure that already exists. Coaches aren't building systems around fringe players, they're looking for players who could fit into roles immediately, and when you don't clearly fit, every possession becomes a test. A shot that once looked like confidence now looks like you're forcing it. A missed pass turns into a question about your ability to read the game, and over time, those small moments start to shape how teams see you. That's what happens when there's no positional clarity. You're constantly being evaluated, not just on your strengths, but on everything you don't do naturally. And for undersized guards, that margin is even smaller. You don't get the luxury of choosing your role, the league chooses it for you. So if your game doesn't match that expectation, you're always playing uphill, trying to prove something that should have already been established. And that's the real lesson. It's not enough to be able to score, even if at a high level, if that scoring doesn't translate within the role you're expected to play. Teams need to know exactly what they're getting from you the moment you step on the floor, and if they have to figure it out, they'll move on to someone who already fits. And once that perception is set, it becomes incredibly difficult to change. In Brown's case, by the time it was clear he didn't fit cleanly into either role, the opportunity to redefine himself had already passed, and at that level, that's all it takes. For younger guards watching, the takeaway is simple but important. Develop your position early, understand how your game translates, and don't rely on what worked at lower levels to carry you forward, because the higher you go, the less room there is to figure it out on the fly. All in all, once Sirvaliant Brown left college, the path he expected didn't unfold the way he thought it would. He entered the NBA draft believing he had done enough, but his name was never called. From his own perspective, part of that came down to poor representation. He spoke openly about not having an agent who properly followed up with teams after workouts, despite getting looks from multiple organizations. Without that push behind the scenes, he felt he slipped through the cracks at a time when he needed someone advocating for him the most. From there, he tried to carve out his own opportunity. He had a stint with the Philadelphia 76ers in Summer League, showing flashes, but it wasn't enough to secure a long-term spot. Instead of finding stability in the NBA, his career shifted into the reality many players face, moving through different opportunities, including time in minor leagues and overseas, trying to keep the dream alive. At the same time, he admitted his focus early on wasn't where it needed to be. He talked about wanting success too fast, getting caught up in the lifestyle, and not fully understanding the business side. Eventually, those experiences gave him perspective, and he turned toward telling his story through a book and documentary. But since then, he continued to be the ghost he always was. Salute, much respect, but for these reasons, his growth was stunted. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth, and I'm out.